We didn't invite you, Emily. My mother said it softly, but not softly enough. The words floated across the round table like a dropped glass, and suddenly the quiet hum of the anniversary dinner seemed to thin out. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Someone near the back stopped laughing. I stood there for a moment beside the long table of wrapped presents, holding the small navy blue box I had brought with me, feeling every pair of eyes in the private dining room shift in my direction. The restaurant was one of those polished places downtown where the lights are low and the wine glasses sparkle under warm gold chandeliers. My parents' 40th anniversary banner hung behind them, silver letters strung neatly above the head table. Diane and Robert Carter. 40 years. Family and friends filled nearly every seat in the room. Cousins I hadn't seen in years. My Uncle George in his usual gray suit. My mother's church friends, all smiling politely as if they hadn't just heard what she said. I noticed the place card in front of my mother's chair first, then the one beside it for my father. Elegant script. Carefully planned seating. I noticed something else too. There was no card for me. I suppose I should have taken that as my first clue before I even walked in. My mother kept her smile fixed, the same polite smile she used when greeting neighbors she barely liked. Her pearls rested perfectly against her navy dress, and not a strand of her silver blonde hair was out of place. She looked past me as if I were someone who had wandered into the wrong room. Emily, she repeated, lowering her voice but still loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, this was meant to be a private celebration. I felt a few guests glance down at their plates. Someone cleared their throat. For a long second nobody spoke. Then I did the only thing that felt natural. I smiled. Not a big smile. Just enough to show I had heard her. Just enough to show I wasn't surprised. I know, I said calmly. My voice sounded steadier than I expected. I stepped forward and placed the small box gently on the table in front of her and my father. The wrapping paper was dark blue with a silver ribbon tied carefully across the top. I had spent nearly 20 minutes tying that bow earlier in the afternoon at my kitchen table. This is for you, I said. My father finally looked up from his wine glass. Robert Carter had always been the quieter one between them. His eyebrows pulled together as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite make sense. Emily, he began, but the sentence never finished. My mother's eyes moved down to the box, then back up to me. Suspicion flickered across her face. You didn't have to bring anything, she said. I tilted my head slightly. I know. The room had grown noticeably quieter now. Conversations that had filled the restaurant moments earlier were fading into small whispers. My cousin Laura leaned toward her husband and murmured something I couldn't hear. My Uncle George watched the box like it might start ticking. The thing about family gatherings is that people sense tension faster than they sense joy. They feel it in the air before anyone explains it. My mother rested her fingertips lightly on the edge of the table. She did not touch the box. Emily, she said again, this time slower, I told you, this evening was not meant for you. I nodded gently. That's all right. I glanced around the room once, taking in the decorated tables, the champagne glasses, the photographs of my parents displayed along the wall from their wedding day back in 1984. Everyone here believed tonight was a celebration. In a way, it was. I slid the box a little closer toward them. You can open it later, I said quietly. But it's important. Then I took a step back from the table, still smiling, while 40 years of family history sat quietly inside that small blue box waiting for the moment someone finally decided to lift the lid. The quiet in the room did not disappear after I stepped away from the table. If anything, it deepened, the kind of polite silence people use when they do not know whether they should continue celebrating or pretend nothing unusual just happened. Someone in the far corner forced a small laugh and lifted a glass of champagne, trying to bring the evening back to life, but the moment had already settled over the room like a thin layer of frost. I walked slowly toward the empty seat near the end of the table where one of the waiters had quietly placed an extra chair. The restaurant smelled faintly of roasted chicken and butter, and the soft piano music drifting from the speakers tried very hard to remind everyone that this was supposed to be a happy occasion. I sat down and folded my hands in my lap, looking toward the large display board behind my parents. Photographs stretched across 4 decades of their marriage. Their wedding picture from 1984, both of them young and bright under the summer sun. A photo from their 10th anniversary barbecue in our old backyard. Another from a beach trip in Florida when I was still in high school. I remembered that day clearly. My father had rented a small boat and insisted we wake up at 6 in the morning to watch the sunrise over the water. Back then family celebrations felt simple. There was always too much food, someone always brought a cake that leaned slightly to one side, and my mother always insisted that everyone gather together for photographs even if nobody wanted to stand still that long. I used to believe those traditions meant something permanent. Something steady. But over the past few years things had shifted in ways that were difficult to explain to anyone outside the family. Conversations had grown shorter. Invitations arrived later, or sometimes not at all. Holidays became smaller gatherings that I only learned about after the photographs appeared online. At first I told myself it was coincidence. People got busy. Families changed. But little by little the pattern became harder to ignore. My cousin Laura slid quietly into the chair beside me and lowered her voice. "Emily, are you all right?" she asked gently. I nodded. "Of course." She glanced toward the head table where my parents still sat with the gift box resting between them like a quiet question nobody wanted to answer. "That was a strange thing for your mother to say," Laura murmured. "Strange things happen at family parties." I kept my tone calm, almost casual. Across the room my father lifted another gift from the pile and began opening it carefully, smiling for the guests who watched him. A set of crystal glasses appeared from one package and everyone applauded politely. My mother leaned toward him, whispering something under her breath while occasionally glancing at the small blue box that remained untouched. It was not the largest gift on the table. It was not the flashiest either. But it seemed to pull the attention of the entire room without anyone quite admitting it. The ribbon reflected the soft light from the chandeliers each time someone moved. A waiter passed by with a tray of sparkling water and paused long enough to look at it before continuing on. People are naturally curious about the things that are not explained. My Uncle George eventually leaned across the table and spoke to my father loud enough for several guests to hear. "Robert, you are going to open that one eventually, right?" he said with a friendly chuckle. My father gave a small polite smile but did not reach for the box. My mother rested one hand beside it as if guarding it from accidental curiosity. I simply watched from my seat at the far end of the table, calm and patient, because the truth about family is that time has a way of bringing every quiet secret back into the light sooner or later. The evening continued the way formal dinners always do, with polite applause, careful laughter, and the quiet rhythm of silverware against porcelain plates, but something subtle had shifted in the room and everyone could feel it even if nobody said it out loud. The blue box remained exactly where I had placed it, resting between my parents like a question that had not yet been asked. My father continued opening the other gifts with the same patient attention he had shown his entire life, carefully unfolding paper, holding up each item for the room to see, smiling and thanking each person by name. A framed photograph from my Uncle George. A crystal vase from my mother's church group. A leather-bound memory album from one of their neighbors. Each gift received its moment of polite celebration before being passed down the table to make space for the next. My mother clapped along with the others, her expression composed, but every so often her eyes drifted back toward the unopened box as if it might suddenly explain itself. From my seat near the end of the table I watched the small movements around it. The way my father's hand paused near it once before reaching instead for a different package. The way my mother adjusted the ribbon slightly without realizing she had touched it. Even the Guests seemed aware of it now. Conversations kept circling back toward the head table. My cousin Laura leaned toward me again and spoke softly. "What is in the box, Emily?" she asked with a hint of curiosity that she tried unsuccessfully to hide. I smiled lightly and lifted my glass of water. "Just something important," I replied. She studied my face for a moment as if searching for a deeper meaning, but eventually nodded and turned back toward the others. Across the table, my Uncle George was telling a story about my parents' first apartment back in the 1980s, describing how the ceiling leaked whenever it rained and how my father once tried to fix the problem with a ladder that was 2 feet too short. Laughter rippled across the room and for a moment the tension eased, but the calm never fully returned. People continued glancing toward the unopened gift. Curiosity is a quiet force. It grows slowly, but once it takes hold it refuses to leave. My father finally reached the bottom of the pile of presents and rested his hands on the table. A few guests clapped again, assuming the gift opening had finished, but then my Uncle George spoke up once more with a playful grin. "Robert, you skipped one." The room grew still again. My father followed George's gaze toward the blue box sitting neatly between him and my mother. For a long second he said nothing. My mother straightened slightly in her chair, her fingers folding together as if she already knew what was about to happen and was not entirely certain she wanted it to happen at all. My father looked across the table toward me. His expression held a quiet question that had not yet been spoken. I simply returned his look and gave the same calm smile I had worn all evening. The kind of smile that reveals nothing. The kind of smile that suggests patience rather than urgency. Slowly he reached forward and placed his hand on the ribbon. The room held its breath the moment my father touched the ribbon. It was a small movement, almost ordinary, yet every conversation faded at once as if the entire dinner had been quietly waiting for this exact moment. My father looked down at the box for a long second before beginning to untie the bow. His fingers moved slowly, carefully. The same way he had opened every gift earlier in the evening, but there was something different in the air now. The ribbon slid loose and fell softly onto the tablecloth. My mother shifted slightly beside him, her posture straight and composed, though I could see the tension in the way her hands remained folded together. Around the room several guests leaned forward just a little, curiosity pulling them closer to the moment without anyone fully admitting it. The piano music continued playing through the restaurant speakers, but it sounded distant now, like background noise from another room. My father lifted the lid of the box. Inside was a simple envelope, cream-colored, sealed with a small gold clasp. It was not dramatic. There were no flashing surprises or decorative ribbons inside, just the envelope resting neatly in the center as if it had been waiting patiently for its turn. My father picked it up and turned it over once, studying the front where his name and my mother's name were written carefully in dark ink. Robert and Diane Carter. He opened the clasp and slid the papers out slowly. For a few seconds the only sound in the room was the faint rustle of the pages unfolding. His eyes began moving across the document line by line. The expression on his face changed gradually, the way sunlight changes across a room as clouds move outside. First confusion. Then concentration. Then something deeper that made his shoulders straighten slightly in his chair. My mother leaned closer. "Robert," she asked quietly. He did not answer right away. Instead he continued reading the pages as if making absolutely certain he understood every word printed there. The guests nearby watched with growing interest. My Uncle George tilted his head slightly, trying to catch a glimpse of the document without appearing rude. My cousin Laura covered her mouth gently as if she could already sense that the quiet dinner had just shifted into something else entirely. Finally my father lowered the papers slightly and looked up across the table toward me. The room had grown so silent that even the clink of a single glass being set down sounded louder than usual. "Emily," he said slowly, his voice filled with cautious disbelief, "what is this?" I rested my hands calmly on the table in front of me. My voice remained steady when I answered. "It is something Grandpa arranged years ago." My mother's eyes widened slightly. Your grandfather, she repeated. My father glanced back down at the papers again, reading one particular line twice before looking up once more. This time the color had begun to fade from my mother's face. My father spoke the words almost as if he was confirming them for himself. This says the house was transferred, legally transferred. He paused, swallowing quietly. To you. The words moved through the room like a quiet ripple across water. No one spoke for a moment. No one even moved. Because everyone sitting there understood something very important had just changed. No one spoke after my father said those words. The sentence seemed to hang in the air above the table like a chandelier that had suddenly begun to sway. The house was transferred to you. My mother stared at the document in my father's hands as if it might rearrange itself if she looked long enough. Her lips parted slightly but no sound came out at first. Around the table several guests exchanged quiet glances. My Uncle George leaned back slowly in his chair, his expression shifting from curiosity to something closer to realization. My father turned the page and read another section carefully, his eyes moving slower this time as if every line required a second confirmation. This cannot be right, my mother said at last, her voice still controlled but noticeably tighter than before. Robert, there must be some misunderstanding. My father did not answer immediately. He continued reading the document all the way to the bottom before lowering it slightly. It is notarized, he said quietly. And it is dated 12 years ago. A soft murmur moved through the guests nearby. 12 years ago meant the arrangement had been made long before tonight, long before most of the quiet distance that had grown between us. My mother finally turned her eyes toward me, the calm politeness she had worn earlier beginning to crack just slightly at the edges. Emily, she said slowly, what exactly are we looking at? I folded my hands together on the table and met her gaze without raising my voice. Grandpa updated his estate documents shortly before he passed away, I said. He asked me to hold on to them until the right time. My father looked down at the page again, his brow tightening. As he found the paragraph I already knew he had reached. This says the property on Oak Ridge Lane, he said carefully, the family house, was placed in a protected transfer agreement. My mother's chair shifted slightly against the floor as she leaned closer. Protected from what? She asked. My father hesitated, then read the line aloud, his voice quieter than before. Protected from sale, transfer, or liquidation without the consent of the legal holder. My Uncle George raised his eyebrows slowly. Several guests exchanged looks that carried more meaning than words. My father lowered the page again and looked across the table at me. And the legal holder, he said, almost reluctantly, is Emily. My mother exhaled slowly, the kind of breath someone takes when a puzzle suddenly becomes much larger than expected. Why would your grandfather do something like that? She asked, her voice softer now but still edged with confusion. I allowed a small pause before answering, not because I needed time to think, but because sometimes the truth sounds clearer when it arrives slowly. Because he was worried, I said gently. The room waited. Worried about what? My mother asked. I held her gaze calmly across the table, the same calm I had carried with me since I first walked into the restaurant. He was worried the house would not stay in the family if he did not protect it first. The silence that followed my words was heavier than anything that had happened earlier in the evening. Even the waiters seemed to slow their steps as they moved between the tables, as if they could sense that something important was unfolding at the center of the room. My mother looked down at the document again, then back at me, her expression carefully controlled but no longer confident. My father remained very still, the papers resting lightly in his hands as though they had suddenly gained more weight than a few sheets of paper should ever carry. My Uncle George leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table with the quiet curiosity of someone who had just realized the story was much larger than it first appeared. Worried about what exactly? My mother repeated, her voice softer now but sharper underneath the surface. I met her gaze without hesitation. Grandpa believed the house should stay exactly where it was, I said calmly. He said it carried too many memories to ever become just another piece of property. My father's eyes moved slowly across the page again, as if he were trying to understand a conversation that had taken place long before he knew about it. This agreement was signed in his lawyer's office, he said quietly. Witnessed and notarized. My Uncle George nodded faintly as he listened. That sounds like your father, he said with a small thoughtful smile. He always planned 3 steps ahead of everyone else. My mother did not smile. Her fingers tapped lightly against the edge of the table, a habit she had whenever something did not go the way she expected. But why you? She asked suddenly, her eyes fixed on me again. Why would he transfer something like that to you instead of keeping it with us? I paused for a moment before answering, not because the answer was difficult but because it deserved to be spoken carefully. Because he trusted me to protect it, I said gently. My father lowered the papers completely now and looked directly at me, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. Protect it from what? He asked. I could feel the attention of the entire table resting on that question. The guests who had been whispering earlier had gone completely silent now. Even the soft piano music drifting through the restaurant seemed to fade behind the moment. I took a slow breath before speaking again. From decisions made too quickly, I said. From people who might see the house as a financial opportunity instead of a family home. My mother's eyes narrowed slightly. Are you suggesting we would do something like that? She asked. I shook my head calmly. I am saying Grandpa worried that someday someone might. My father studied the document again, then looked around the room filled with relatives, friends, and decades of shared history. For the first time since opening the box he spoke more slowly, almost thoughtfully. There is another page here, he said quietly, sliding the final sheet from the envelope. The room leaned into the moment again as he unfolded it. His eyes moved across the short letter written in familiar handwriting. After a few seconds he looked up again, his expression changed in a way that made the entire room wait for his next words. My father held the final page in his hands for several seconds. Before saying anything. The paper looked older than the rest of the documents, slightly yellow at the edges, and the handwriting across the top was unmistakable to anyone in our family. My grandfather had always written with thick blue ink and careful straight lines, the kind of handwriting that looked almost like it belonged in a history book. My father cleared his throat quietly as he read the first sentence to himself. His expression softened in a way I had not seen all evening. It is a letter, he said slowly, almost more to himself than to anyone else. My mother leaned closer, trying to read the page from where she sat, but my father lifted it slightly and began reading aloud. To my family, he started, his voice steady but noticeably quieter than before. The entire table fell silent again, the kind of silence that does not come from tension but from the feeling that something important deserves to be heard clearly. If you are reading this, my father continued, then Emily has finally decided the time was right to show you what I arranged before I left. My Uncle George leaned forward, listening closely now, and several guests who had been sitting farther away turned their chairs slightly toward the table. My father continued reading. The house on Oak Ridge Lane has been the center of this family for more than 50 years. I built that porch with my own hands. I planted the oak tree by the driveway the year Robert was born. Every holiday meal, every birthday cake, every quiet Sunday afternoon happened under that roof. My father paused for a moment, his eyes moving across the next lines more slowly. A house like that is not simply a property, he read. It is a piece of our history. My mother folded her hands tightly together on the table as she listened. My father continued. In recent years I began to worry that the house might one day become something else. A business opportunity. A quick decision. A transaction made too easily. Several guests shifted slightly in their chairs. The meaning behind the words was becoming clearer with every sentence. My father's voice grew softer as he reached the next part. Emily understands the value of memory, he read. She has always understood that some things are meant to be protected, not traded away. My Uncle George nodded slowly as if that statement matched something he had always known. My father lowered the page for a moment and looked across the table at me again. His expression was no longer confused now. It was thoughtful. Perhaps even a little proud. Then he lifted the page again and finished the final lines. If the day ever comes when this letter is read aloud, he said quietly, then remember that family is not measured by who owns the house. Family is measured by who chooses to protect it. When my father finished reading, the silence in the room returned once again, but this time it felt different. It was no longer the silence of curiosity or tension. It was the silence that comes when everyone in the room realizes they have just witnessed the truth arrive all at once. For several long seconds no one at the table spoke. The words from my grandfather's letter seemed to linger in the air long after my father finished reading them. My father slowly folded the page and placed it carefully back on the table beside the other documents. The small blue box that had seemed so ordinary earlier now looked like the center of the entire room. My mother sat very still, her eyes fixed on the letter as if she were trying to understand how an evening that had begun with champagne and celebration had quietly turned into something else entirely. Around us the guests shifted in their seats, the earlier curiosity now replaced by thoughtful silence. My Uncle George finally leaned back and let out a soft breath. Your father always did believe that house was the heart of the family, he said gently. I remember him saying that more than once. My father nodded slowly. So do I, he replied. His voice sounded calmer now, steadier than it had earlier in the evening. He looked down again at the papers in front of him and then across the table toward me. You have been carrying this for 12 years, he asked. I nodded once. Grandpa asked me to keep it safe, I said quietly. He told me the right moment would come eventually. My mother finally lifted her eyes from the table and looked at me directly. The sharp edge that had been in her voice earlier had softened, replaced by something more uncertain. And tonight is that moment, she asked. I gave a small, calm smile. Tonight felt like the right time. For a moment she said nothing. Her fingers traced the edge of the folded letter as if the paper itself carried memories she had forgotten. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer the tense silence from earlier. It felt more reflective now, like the pause that happens when people suddenly see a familiar story from a completely different angle. My father leaned back slightly in his chair and looked around the table at the relatives and friends who had gathered to celebrate 40 years of marriage. I suppose this explains a few things, he said thoughtfully. My Uncle George chuckled softly. It certainly explains why Emily walked in here looking calmer than anyone else in the room, he replied. A few guests smiled at that, the first genuine smiles of the evening. I reached for my glass of water and took a slow sip, letting the moment settle naturally without rushing it. My father picked up the documents again and placed them carefully back inside the envelope before sliding it gently across the table toward me. Your grandfather trusted you with this, he said quietly. That means something. I accepted the envelope but did not place it back in the box yet. Instead, I rested it lightly in my hands and looked across the table at both of my parents. The anniversary dinner that had begun with music and polite laughter now felt quieter, more honest somehow. Sometimes it takes only a single letter, written years earlier, to remind a family what truly matters. The restaurant slowly began to breathe again after the long silence, but the atmosphere of the evening had changed in a way that everyone in the room could feel. Conversations returned quietly, glasses touched the table again, and someone near the back laughed softly at something unrelated, yet the attention of the entire table remained centered on the envelope still resting in my hands. My father leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful, as though he were replaying the past several years in his mind and seeing them from a different perspective. My mother remained quieter than usual, her gaze occasionally moving from the letter to me and then toward the photographs displayed behind us on the wall. 40 years of memories looked down at the table where the truth had just unfolded. After a moment my father folded his hands together and spoke again, this time with the calm tone he used whenever something important needed to be acknowledged. Your grandfather always believed the house meant more than the walls around it, he said slowly. I suppose tonight he reminded us of that. My Uncle George nodded in agreement and lifted his glass slightly toward me with a small respectful smile. Several other relatives followed his gesture, their earlier curiosity now replaced with a quiet understanding. The evening was no longer about surprise or tension. It had become something closer to reflection. My mother finally looked directly at me again, her voice softer than it had been when I first arrived. Emily, she said carefully, why did you bring this tonight of all nights? I considered the question for a moment before answering, because the truth deserved to be spoken plainly. Because tonight was about family, I said gently. And Grandpa believed the house was where our family always found its way back together. My father gave a slow nod as if that explanation made perfect sense. He glanced around the room once more at the relatives, friends, and familiar faces who had gathered to celebrate the years he and my mother had spent building a life together. Then he looked back at me with a quiet smile that had not been there earlier in the evening. Well, he said lightly, it seems you chose the right moment after all. A few guests laughed softly, the tension dissolving completely now. I placed the envelope carefully back inside the blue box and tied the ribbon loosely across the lid again before sliding it gently toward my father and mother. It belongs with the family, I said calmly. My father rested his hand on top of the box for a moment, thoughtful but no longer uncertain. Across the room the piano music continued playing, the warm lights reflecting softly off the glasses and silverware. The celebration resumed, quieter but more sincere than before, and as I sat there watching my parents surrounded by friends and memories, I realized that sometimes the most powerful gift a person can give a family is not something new at all, but a reminder of what they were always meant to protect together.